The American frontier was a wild place. In less than 70 years, the U.S. went from about 300,000 square miles that were the original 13 colonies to controlling the entire continental U.S. that we know today, gobbling up an astounding 2.8 million square miles of land. It's one of the largest, fastest land grabs in history. And the things that went down during this time were not for the faint of heart. The period was marked by near-continual warfare, often in impossible terrain. It took a certain kind of crazy to survive on the frontier. Today on Nutty History, we'll be discussing the filthy secrets of the frontiersman. The Wild Life of Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone is probably one of the most famous Americans in history. He was a legendary frontiersman who became immortalized over the years through books and movies. He helped open up the American frontier during the Revolutionary War when he discovered the Cumberland Pass into Kentucky. He blazed the Wilderness Road, another key passageway into the West, and through all of it, he had some pretty crazy adventures. And one of them is straight out of the plot of the movie Taken. It was 1776. Boone had established the town of Boonesboro a year earlier, and the Revolutionary War was in full swing. In July, Boone's daughter, Jemima, who was just 14 years old at the time, was taken captive along with two other young women, Betsy and Fanny Calloway. The girls were captured by a group of Shawnee warriors who had been sent by the British to harass and attack the American settlers in Kentucky. The girls were taken to a Shawnee village near present-day Chillicothe, Ohio, where they were held captive. Boone learned of this, and he wasn't pleased, to say the least. He and a group of men immediately set out in pursuit of the Shawnee kidnappers. They tracked the Shawnee to their village and carefully planned a surprise attack. On the third day of his daughter's captivity, Boone and his men tore into the village where the girls were being held, and they were able to rescue them, fatally shooting a few of the kidnappers in the process while the rest fled. The fact that Boone tracked down the kidnappers and rescued his daughter was yet another feather in his cap and proof of his wilderness skills. He had a particular set of skills.
But what I do have are a very particular set of skills.
Another pivotal point in Daniel Boone's life came a few years later. In 1778, during the American Revolution, the British teamed up with a couple of Native American tribes and began a series of attacks on American frontier settlements. One of these attacks was on Boonesboro. The siege of Boonesboro began in September 1778 when a large force of Shawnee warriors, led by a guy named Chief Blackfish with the support of British officers, surrounded the fort to lay siege to it. The settlers at Boonesboro were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were able to hold off the attack, for a while at least. But despite the settlers' best efforts, they eventually began to run low on supplies and ammunition. The situation became more desperate when several of the enslaved fighters who had been fighting alongside the settlers defected to the Shawnee, taking with them much-needed ammunition. Despite all the legends surrounding Daniel Boone, he was yet another early American settler who tolerated forced labor. Eventually, the settlers were forced to negotiate a surrender with the Shawnee. Boone and several other settlers were taken captive and held for several months. During his time with the Shawnee, Daniel Boone was treated pretty well, and he was even adopted into the tribe as the son of Chief Blackfish. Boone was actually given the name Sheltowee, which translates to Big Turtle, and he was allowed to hunt and fish with the tribe. He also learned the Shawnee language and customs, and he gained a deep appreciation for their way of life. But Boone couldn't come and go as he pleased. He was still a prisoner and was closely monitored by the Shawnee. Like any captive who knows his way around the woods and knows his way around a gun, Boone tried to escape. He slipped out of the village one night, but the Shawnee figured it out almost immediately, caught him, and brought him back. For his bad behavior, he had to run a gauntlet where he was stripped naked and forced to run between two lines of people who hit him with sticks as he went by. Boone survived the punishment, and he was eventually allowed to return to his family after several months in captivity. Boone's time with the Shawnee had a pretty big impact on him, and he later wrote about his experiences in his autobiography. He described the Shawnee as a brave and generous people, and he expressed admiration for their hunting and warrior skills, despite the fact that they hit him with a bunch of sticks and wouldn't let him leave for a while. Davy Crockett, Dirty Politics, and the Alamo. What happens when a rough and gruff frontiersman becomes a U.S. representative, but then gets so disillusioned by the bureaucratic nonsense of it all that he can't stand it anymore? He says screw it, and he moves to Texas. This is the story of Davy Crockett. Now, you probably think of him as this coonskip cap-wearing, rifle-toting hunter-slash-wilderness guide, but there was a whole lot more to him than that. Crockett was born August 17, 1786 in eastern Tennessee, in what was then part of North Carolina. His parents were poor farmers and he grew up having to fend for himself quite often. By the time he was 18, Crockett struck out on his own and began working as a cattle driver, guiding herds of livestock through the wilderness to markets in Virginia and Georgia. He quickly gained a reputation as a skilled frontiersman and hunter, and became known for his sharpshooting skills and ability to survive in the wilderness. There's even one pretty wild story that's straight from the movie Revenant. The story goes that in the fall of 1825, Crockett was out hunting in the woods near his home in Tennessee when he came across a large black bear. Crockett fired a shot at it, but the bear was so big that it kept charging and knocked him to the ground. Crockett managed to draw his knife and engage in a hand-to-hand struggle with the bear. The two scrapped for several minutes, with Crockett puncturing the bear repeatedly until it finally succumbed to its injuries. According to the legend, Crockett suffered several injuries during the encounter, including a broken leg and multiple cuts and bruises. Whether the story is true or not is not really the point. The point is that Crockett was building up a pretty legendary persona that would eventually get him elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. A piece of publicity that helped rocket Crockett, you see what I did there, into the national spotlight was a play called The Lion of the West. The play's main character wasn't named Davy Crockett, but he looked and acted a whole lot like the frontiersman. The play, which premiered in 1831, was a satirical comedy that poked fun at frontier life and politics with a Crockett-esque main character. In the play, Crockett was portrayed as a larger-than-life figure, full of bluster and braggadocio, but also with a heart of gold. Aw shucks. The character's homespun humor and folksy charm resonated with audiences across the country and helped to cement Crocker's status as an American icon. The play was also significant because it coincided with the rise of Andrew Jackson. Crockett, who was initially a strong supporter of Jackson, was seen as a symbol of the rugged individualism and self-reliance that were prized by the Jacksonian Democrats. Crockett was a rising star, but he'd soon come to learn how low down and dirty politics could be. During his time as a U.S. representative from 1824 to 1835, Davy Crockett became increasingly frustrated with the political process in Washington. He was a member of the Whig Party, but he often clashed with party leaders and disagreed with their policies. One of Crockett's main frustrations was with what he saw as excessive government spending. He believed that the federal government was becoming too powerful and that it was wasting taxpayer money on unnecessary projects. He became particularly critical of President Jackson, despite the fact that the two were pretty good friends and allies initially. He came to realize how despicable Jackson actually was and how he was abusing his power and favoring his political allies over the interest of the country. The final straw that led to Crockett eventually leaving Congress and heading to Texas was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Crockett actually supported the act at first. He figured that the relocation would be beneficial for the Native Americans, since they'd be removed from the influence of white settlers and given new land to cultivate. He also saw it as a way to open up new land for white settlement and to further expand the United States. But as the debate over the Indian Removal Act continued, Crockett started having doubts. He received letters from his constituents expressing opposition to the forced removal of the Cherokee people who were living in his home state of Tennessee. He eventually became a vocal opponent of the act. In a famous speech to Congress, Crockett declared that the Indian Removal Act was unjust and that the government had no right to force Native Americans from their land. He argued that the Cherokee people had a right to their ancestral homeland and that they should be allowed to stay. Despite his opposition, the act was ultimately passed, which led to the forced removal of thousands of Native Americans on the Trail of Tears. Disillusioned and pretty angry, Davy Crockett moved to Texas and got involved in the Texas fight for independence from Mexico. He arrived in San Antonio in early 1836 and joined a group of volunteers defending the Alamo, an old Spanish mission that had been converted into a fortress. Crockett and his fellow defenders, which included some famous frontiersmen in their own right, including Jim Bowie, of Bowie knife fame, faced off against a Mexican army led by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. The siege of the Alamo lasted for 13 days, with Crockett and the Texans holding out against overwhelming odds, outnumbered by more than 10-1. But on the morning of March 6, 1836, the Mexicans launched a final assault on the Alamo, and it all came crashing down. The final battle lasted less than 2 hours, and everyone defending the fort lost their lives, including Crockett. It's not entirely certain how Crockett bit the bullet. Some say he died as one of the final defenders in a heroic last stand. Others say he and the few remaining men surrendered and were executed soon after. Either way, it was a valiant bookend to one of the country's most interesting frontiersmen. Birth of the Oregon Trail and a new country. This next guy was one of the main reasons the Oregon Trail came to be, but his life was a controversial one. He thought of himself kind of like an 1800s freedom fighter who didn't think he had to answer to any government and even tried to start his own country to prove it. John C. Fremont was a surveyor and explorer who eventually ran for president of the United States and attempted to create the short-lived independent Republic of California. Like many frontiersmen, his life was a weird one. In 1833, Fremont joined the Navy and became a math teacher on board the USS Natchez. He spent the next few years exploring the coastal waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, learning how to survey and chart new territories. He was discharged from the Navy in 1838 and moved to Washington, D.C., where he worked as an assistant to the chief clerk of the U.S. Bureau of Topographical Engineers. Fremont's early experiences in the Navy and the topographical engineers prepared him for his future career as an explorer and mapmaker. He learned how to navigate difficult terrain, make accurate measurements, and record his findings in detailed maps and reports. He eventually went out west, where he was instrumental in mapping out the Oregon Trail. He helped publicize the trail and even worked with Native American tribes to make sure relations between them and the new settlers moving along the trail were as peaceful as possible. Yet there were quite a few stories of Fremont's western expeditions not ending well for the Native Americans. In 1844, Fremont and his expedition took over a Native American village near the Great Salt Lake in Utah without permission. They destroyed the village and crops and killed several Native Americans. Later, during an 1845 expedition, Fremont and his men came across a group of Klamath Indians in California. When one of Fremont's horses was stolen, he ordered his men to attack the Klamath village, ending several people's lives and burning their homes. Despite his questionable treatment of Native Americans, Fremont was actually an abolitionist. In a lot of ways, he was really a confusing guy to pin down. Later in his life, when he became the first presidential candidate for the newly formed Republican Party, and then later when he was the governor of Missouri, he supported many abolitionist causes. But maybe the most famous came shortly after the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. It became known as the Fremont Emancipation. Fremont was then the military governor of Missouri, when he declared that all slaves owned by Confederates in the soon-to-be state should be free. It was an important step toward abolition in the state and was seen as a significant political move by Fremont, who was known for his cojones. The order was met with mixed reaction. Abolitionists and Unionists applauded the decision, while many slave owners and pro-Confederate sympathizers were outraged. President Abraham Lincoln was concerned about the legality of the order and its potential to drive Missouri, which was a border state, into the Confederacy. Lincoln also thought that military commanders, which was what Fremont was, didn't have the authority to issue proclamations of emancipation, and he feared that Fremont's actions would complicate efforts to keep the border states loyal to the Union. Lincoln was pragmatic, but still basically agreed with Fremont, but he asked Fremont to modify his proclamation. But Fremont refused. So Lincoln had it annulled and replaced Fremont with a new commander. They would later kiss and make up, and Lincoln appointed Fremont to a command in Virginia where he fought against the Confederacy. But one of Fremont's ballsiest and most controversial moves came 15 years earlier when he quite literally conquered California. But to get into that, we need to meet another significant frontiersman who helped him do it, Kit Carson. Kit Carson, Mountain Man. Kit Carson was an American frontiersman, a fur trapper, wilderness guide, Indian agent, and soldier. He was a man who wore a lot of hats. He was born on December 24, 1809, in Kentucky, and became famous for his adventures in the American West during the 19th century. He worked as a fur trapper and mountain man in the western frontier, where he built his skills at navigating the wilderness and dealing with Native American tribes. At the age of 16, Carson became an apprentice to a saddle maker, but quickly became restless and left to join a group of traders heading to Santa Fe, New Mexico. In Santa Fe, Carson became a fur trapper and mountain man, and he quickly gained a reputation as an expert guide and hunter. He spent much of his early career in the Rocky Mountains, trapping beavers and other fur-bearing animals. During this time, he also worked as a guide for expeditions into the frontier, including the 1829 to 1830 expedition led by Ewing Young and the 1832 to 1833 expedition led by Captain Benjamin Bonneville. He would go on to have a storied career in the military, particularly during the Mexican-American War, and then later during the Civil War, where he fought for the Union. Carson would become one of the most famous frontiersmen of this time, thanks to a series of dime novels called The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson. Dime novels were cheap, kind of gossipy, often sensationalized little books that just about anyone could afford to read. Carson's dime novel series, written by a guy named DeWitt C. Peters, ran from 1843 to 1897 and helped establish Carson as a legendary figure in the American folklore. He was later portrayed in a bunch of other films and television series, including the 1940 film Kit Carson, in which the brave Kit helps defeat a group of Native Americans attacking a wagon train. You can even find him in the 2010 video game Red Dead Redemption. The Conquest of California. Finally, let's get into how Carson and Fremont teamed up and briefly conquered California. Kit Carson and John C. Fremont met for the first time in 1842 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Fremont was leading an expedition to explore and map the Western Territories, and he hired Carson as a guide. What happened next was one of the strangest stories of the American frontier. Towards the end of 1845, Fremont, Carson, and the rest of their expedition arrived in California and began making contact with American settlers and other foreigners who were living there. At the same time, tensions between Mexican authorities and American residents was already high, and Fremont's arrival only added to the unease. Carson played a key role throughout their time in California, serving as a scout and messenger for Fremont. He also helped to capture the town of Sonoma, which served as the headquarters for what would become known as the Bear Flag Revolt. Fremont eventually met with a group of American settlers in Sonoma, where they discussed the possibility of declaring independence from Mexico. Fremont was cautious at first about getting involved in any overtly political activities, but he did provide the settlers with weapons and ammunition from his own supplies. On June 14th, the rebels raised the Bear Flag, a symbol of their independence, and declared the establishment of the California Republic, with Fremont as their leader. Many of you probably know the flag they raised pretty well. It was this one, complete with a star, a bear, and the words California Republic. The revolt was short-lived, though. The U.S. Army quickly swooped in and took control of the region as part of the larger war effort against Mexico. The Bear Flag Revolt had significant consequences for the future of California and the United States. It helped to establish American control over the region and paved the way for California to become a state in 1850. It also marked the beginning of a long history of conflict and tension between American settlers and indigenous peoples in California. There were a few reasons why Fremont got in trouble. First off, he was a private citizen and didn't have official authorization from the U.S. government to carry out any military operations in California. He took it upon himself to lead a group of American settlers and military forces in California to revolt against the Mexican government and declare an independent republic. This action was viewed by many as illegal and unauthorized, and Fremont was subsequently court-martialed for a mutiny and insubordination. Fremont was also criticized for his brutality towards Mexican civilians and Native American tribes, and Fremont himself was accused of executing prisoners without trial. Fremont's role in the whole thing was obviously pretty controversial, and like I said, he was eventually court-martialed for insubordination and mutiny. But he claimed that he hadn't participated in the rebellion, despite a whole lot of evidence to the contrary. It worked out for Fremont, though. As we mentioned earlier, he became an influential general and politician who eventually ran for president. The Oregon Trail made Butch Cassidy. The Oregon Trail, the one that John C. Fremont helped create, was a treacherous journey that wasn't for the faint of heart. Over the course of America's westward expansion, an estimated 1 in 10 people lost their lives trying to find better lives in the West, somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 in total. That's about 20 graves per mile. There were a few factors that contributed to the high mortality rates on the trail. Accidents, freezing cold weather, and attacks by Native Americans were just a few of them. Many people also suffered from malnutrition and dehydration. It was difficult to carry enough food and water for the long journey, and a lack of medical care meant that any infection was a possible death sentence. But one famous Wild West figure owes his life to the Oregon Trail. His parents met on it. Butch Cassidy, while not really a frontiersman, was definitely one of the most infamous personalities of the time. The bank and train robber was born in Utah in 1866 to Mormon parents who just barely made it there. According to the legend, Cassidy's parents, Maximilian Parker and Anne Campbell Gillies, both immigrated to the United States from Scotland in the mid-19th century. They met on the Oregon Trail, where they were both part of a group of Mormon pioneers traveling to the Salt Lake Valley. The group they were with almost didn't make it. They were part of what became known as the Mormon Handcart Tragedy. The Mormon Handcart Tragedy was a series of events that occurred during the mid-19th century as Mormon pioneers traveled westward to Utah. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints encouraged its members to use handcarts instead of the traditional covered wagons, because the handcarts were cheaper, but it turned out to be a bad move. In 1856, 2 companies of Mormon handcart pioneers left Iowa City, Iowa, and headed for Salt Lake City, Utah. There were about 1,000 of them in total. They didn't time the journey very well and had to face a harsh winter as they crossed the Wyoming plains. They also had to haul their handcarts and also didn't have much in the way of supplies. So many of the pioneers became sick and weak from the conditions. As their food and supplies dwindled, some of the pioneers resorted to eating the leather from their shoes and belts to survive. The pioneers pressed on though, and some were able to reach safety in Utah. But more than 200 of them died as a result of the harsh weather and lack of supplies, and many others suffered from frostbite and other injuries. Luckily for Cassidy, though unluckily for the people he killed and the owners of the banks and trains he robbed, his parents made it through the ordeal. Sacka Jia. No story about America's frontiersmen would be complete without mentioning their most important guides. Sacka Jia was perhaps one of the most famous guides of one of the most famous frontier expeditions in history, the expedition of Lewis and Clark. Sacka Jia had a pretty harrowing childhood. She was born into the Lemhi Shoshone tribe. Some call them the Lemhi Shoshone tribe in what's now Idaho around 1788. But when she was about 10 years old, a group of Hidatsa warriors raided her village and captured her and several other girls. The Hidatsa were a neighboring tribe to the Shoshone, and they really didn't get along. What happened next gets a bit foggy, but according to some accounts, Sacka Jia was sold to a French-Canadian trader named Toussaint Charbonneau and his wife, who was a Hidatsa named Otter Woman. Charbonneau had been living among the Hidatsa and had already taken Otter Woman as his wife, but he was open to having options and was apparently in the market for a second wife who could speak Shoshone and Hidatsa and could help him navigate the West. Another story suggests that Charbonneau won Sacka Jia in a game of chance, either dice or cards from the group of Hidatsa men who had captured her. In this version, Charbonneau wasn't looking for wife number 2, but instead saw an opportunity to use Sacka Jia's language skills to his advantage. Regardless of how it happened, Sacka Jia became Charbonneau's wife and accompanied him on his travels throughout the West. When the Lewis and Clark expedition arrived at the Hidatsa village in 1804, they hired Charbonneau as an interpreter and guide, and Sacka Jia joined them on their journey. She was a vital piece of the expedition. She helped translate and communicate with other tribes they encountered along the way. She even crossed the Rocky Mountains while pregnant. Give that a try sometimes and see how it goes. And if it were not for Sacka Jia, many of the documents from the expedition, including maps and journals, could have been lost forever. The story goes that the expedition was traveling down the Missouri River when their boat, which was carrying important documents, supplies, and instruments, capsized in rough waters. The boat and its contents were quickly swept away by the current. But Sacka Jia sprang into action. She was traveling on another boat with her infant son, saw what happened, jumped to the bank of the river, and quickly gathered up as much of the stuff as she could. Were it not for the Shoshone guide, Lewis and Clark might have had to redo the whole expedition, or else some other dynamic duo would have, and we'd be saying their names right now instead. These are just a few stories of the frontiersmen who helped shape America. What else do you want to know about them? Let us know in the comments. History, literature, and pop culture like to portray the Victorian era as the golden standards of sophistication, class, and prudence. But often, the cleanest cloth is hiding the dirtiest secret. Today, the oldest trade in the history of humanity is perceived as a great social evil by many. But that infamous tag worn by the brothel industry was bestowed upon it only in the 19th century. There were more brothels and schools in London during the Victorian era. The propaganda led by newspapers and pamphlets against the industry gave the workers of the trade a bad name. This resulted in a hostile environment and a bad repute that resulted in cases like the infamous Victorian Jack. But did Victorian brothels deserve such hatred? Welcome to Nutty History, and today, let's find out how filthy brothels were during the Victorian era. In his 1857 report, Few Odd Characters of the London Streets, Henry Mayhew mentioned that around 8,600 women were working the trade in London. It was an estimation and a wrong one by miles. His estimation was based on how many women were known by the police to be in this line of work, but the actual number was far, far greater. 80,000. 80,000 women in London were occupied in the oldest profession known to mankind during the year 1857, the peak of the Victorian era. The popularity of the trade makes sense during Victorian times because the brothel industry had enjoyed a golden age during the 17th and 18th centuries, and it was still riding the high despite changing perceptions of society. I mean, there was no better place to earn the money for the fairer gender. Say you are a well-educated woman at the height of the times when another prominent woman was ruling your country. and you were given ample opportunities to learn and be productive in society. However, there was a catch. Your gender still determined your wage, and not your efforts. Women who learn high-level skills in college, like typing and shorthand, because let's be honest, who are we kidding? This is the 19th century, and we said ample opportunities, not the best opportunities because of gender bias. Even the women who made it to the top possible positions in reputable establishments only made an average of 25 shillings per year. It was nowhere close to supporting themselves or their children, and they were still largely dependent on their husbands' wages. In stark contrast, brothels offered them shorter hours and higher wages, and they were paid in cash. If you hit the genetic jackpot and happen to have good looks, this profession would offer much better odds of success in a short time. Brothels didn't just offer better working conditions, but also independence, and that's what made them so lucrative. While in modest London, you could only be a street vendor or shop girl, and if you are very, very lucky, you may end up as a household servant to a lord or their lady. But in brothels, even a low-class woman could find enough income to live like a lady herself. Well, not everyone, but they still could have a good life without being dependent on a male figure. So, how could one become as successful as a lady while working in the profession of the skin? Well, as we mentioned, not every woman in this profession could accomplish that status. In fact, there were 3 classes of professionals in the industry during the Victorian times. To achieve a lavish lifestyle like the nobility of the 19th century, the very first qualification in the brothel industry was to be really attractive. We're talking about Bella Hadid and Lupita Nyong'o's level of beauty here. Now that was an exaggeration, but you see what I'm saying, right? These women served only the elite, nobles, and aristocrats, the members of the parliaments, people related to the royal family, the lords, the generals, and the cream of the crop of industrialists. Those sorts of wealthy people. Some were even exclusive, working only with single clients, as these courtesans would often end up as mistresses living with their clients' families, or sometimes they would end up marrying the clients too. Oh, happy endings. Yeah, in more than one way. These were, of course, the highest-rated courtesans. The middle class of brothel workers, like the high-level courtesans, didn't actually work in brothels. They were the women who preferred to work freelance. They would have their own apartment to serve a variety of clients, and some would also work on the streets as well. It came with the independence of choosing their clients and not having a boss, but on the flip side, there was no job security or protection that brothel workers had. They were quite prone to both infectious diseases and insane clients. This is why perhaps this class included a lot of married women whose husbands would work as their agents and protectors. Yeah, it may be a culture shock for our time, but this was a thing in Victorian London. A lot of street vendors had their wives working as cheap courtesans to make extra money to match the ever-growing demand for household expenditures. I mean, just look at Victorian fashion. Even rags during that age would have cost a fortune. Some wives readily agreed to work in the field, while others were forced by their husbands. And if you were a low-class single woman, this was the only way to stay afloat until you found a husband. Not to mention the profession helped with that as well. It was pretty much similar to how a lot of people these days have an entertainment account only for their fans. If you know, you know. The lowest class of brothel workers were the women who actually worked in brothels. They were forced to be with the men the madam selected for them, and they weren't allowed to deny services. The working and living conditions were poor, filthy, and unkempt. But madams also tried their best to keep their health in check to save them from venereal diseases, as these ailments were not only dangerous for the women's longevity as a worker, but also brought disrepute to the establishment. On the surface, high-class courtesans to low-class brothel workers may have had their work cut from the same cloth. But not everybody likes to order vanilla when they go to an ice cream parlor. Isn't that the truth? Some people have a more exotic taste, like Rocky Road and British Glow ice cream. And some may not say it publicly, but could be closet gluttons for wasabi ice cream or ketchup-flavored ice cream. Oh, ketchup. Ugh. Well, we better not judge others, and neither did the brothels of the Victorian era. In fact, they looked at it as an opportunity and provided those exotic flavors. As we all know, Victorian times were quite prudent and judgmental, expecting everybody to behave and desire in a certain manner. Many men didn't get what they wanted from their significant others in their marriage. Most of them weren't even bold enough to mention it to their wives. and a certain number of them had desires that their wives were just biologically incapable of fulfilling. During the Victorian era, women were not allowed to have a liberal mindset when it comes to bedtime, so that explains a lot of stuff we just mentioned. But brothels were a place where there was no judgment regarding one's inhibitions, and one could get what they wanted, given they were in the right place. Brothels understood that, and they began dealing in expertise establishments that would offer exclusive services that were in demand. Themed brothels also had these establishments to keep their client list private and avoid risky vagrants. Brothels would also publish their sporting guides or catalogs featuring their products. These books detailed brothel workers' profiles for the prospective clients to browse and choose women from the luxury of their homes before visiting an establishment. Profiles included ages, physical descriptions, personality types, and the cost of their service. One of the most famous guides was the Swells Guide through the Metropolis. In 2018, an extremely rare first edition of this guide was unearthed. It provides an eye-popping insight into the brothels of Victorian London. The 19th century may have been conservative in many ways, but it was liberal when it came to women's education. Even brothel workers received a formal education. However, the education for women was still limited to skills that made them attractive for marriage, not to enable them to actually earn a living. The majority of working-class women were unable to read or write. According to Henry Mayhew, only 5% of the low-class brothel workers were literate. They usually would ask their clients to read newspapers to them so they could stay up to date on current events. Higher-class courtesans, however, were skilled in many ways, like etiquette, dancing, drawing, and playing piano. But as they spent most of their time with members of parliaments and such on work, they outgrew domestic homemaker women in terms of becoming more cultured and knowledgeable of the world around them. Another challenge as a brothel worker was the infectious diseases that were most commonly spread through young men in the military. Venereal disease was so common in the 1800s that it killed just as many military men as going to battle. This led to the passing of the Contagious Diseases Act in the British Parliament. Any woman suspected of dealing in coital services could be summoned to undergo an unavoidable medical examination. If it was discovered that she was infected, she would be forced into rehabilitation for the fallen women for up to 3 months. Although the risk of contracting venereal diseases was high in this industry, women working in brothels were actually much healthier than average working-class women because they did not have to endure a grueling 14-hour workday in factories. So, what do you think? Could you have survived life as a woman in the Victorian era? We hope you enjoyed the video. Please share and like it. There are a lot of sick people out there. People that have 20 tabs open on their browser. People who say they prefer Pepsi than Coke. People who keep the toilet roll like this. But there are people even more deprived, people who have done things so horrible just knowing about them might make you want to crawl under your bed. Just look under your bed first. And while a whole lot of these horrible people have been men, women have had their fair share of monsters over the years. Here are the filthy secrets of some of the scariest women in history. Bloody Mary. The Blood Countess and Bloody Mary might have been pretty good friends. Maybe. I'm not sure how pleased Queen Mary of England would have been about all the dead people piled up in Elizabeth Bathory's Slovakian castle. But if they were Protestants, Mary might have been very cool with it. Mary was a Protestant hater. Queen Mary I was the daughter of Henry VIII during England's Tudor period. We recently made a video on why you wouldn't survive life in Tudor England, so we recommend checking it out after this video. Anyway, the times were marked by pretty severe swings between support for Catholicism and support for Protestantism. And there was a whole lot of persecution being doled out to either side, depending on who was on the throne. Unlike her father, Henry VIII, who split with the Catholic Church and basically created the Church of England so he could divorce a bunch of his wives, Mary was a devout Catholic. As a result, she spent her brief rule, which lasted from 1553 to 1558, trying to reinstall Catholicism as the official religion of England. And she did it pretty mercilessly. She kicked things off by restoring Catholic practices and ordering the burning of Protestant books. But it eventually escalated to the full-on execution of Protestants. During her reign, around 280 Protestants were executed for heresy, many of them by being burnt at the stake. This earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Among the most famous victims were the Protestant bishops Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Riddler, and Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was heavily involved in Henry VIII's break from the Catholic Church by helping him pass the Act of Supremacy in 1534. Mary saw Cranmer's execution as a personal victory and reportedly ordered that he be burned slowly. Yeah, I'm thinking she didn't like him a lot. Mary's persecution of Protestants was controversial not only because of the number of people executed, but also because of the way in which they were. Burning at the stake was a particularly gruesome form of execution, and it was seen as a way to make a public spectacle of the victims and to intimidate other Protestants. Bloody Mary's bloody reign and her push towards making England Catholic again was largely reversed by her successor Elizabeth I, who would then seesaw and start persecuting Catholics. The things people do in the name of religion. The soap maker of Correggio. This hasn't been the cleanest of lists, and the soap made by this next woman is one you for sure wouldn't want to use anywhere on your body. Leonardo Ciunciulli was born in Italy in 1894 and suffered from health problems throughout her life. She had a total of 17 pregnancies during her marriage, but only 4 of her children survived into adulthood. Because of this, she was extremely protective of her surviving children and was devastated when one of her sons announced that he was enlisting in the Italian army during World War II. Leonardo was a superstitious woman who believed deeply in the power of magic and the supernatural, but things got really dark when she became convinced that the only way to protect her son from losing his life in the war was by sacrificing human lives. So she started looking for victims. She targeted women who were alone and had no family, believing that their disappearance would go unnoticed. She convinced her victims to write letters to their families, saying that they were moving away and would not be in contact again. She then drugged and killed them and used their bodies to make tea cakes and soap, which she would then serve up to her neighbors. She apparently figured that by making the soap, she'd be able to wash herself clean of the sacrifices. Leonardo was eventually caught and arrested after one of her 3 victims was reported missing by her sister. When the police searched Leonardo's home, they found the remains of 3 bodies and a pot containing human fat. Leonardo confessed to her crimes and was sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. Creepily enough, Leonardo had paid a visit to a Romani fortune teller some years earlier, who reportedly told her that in your right hand I see prison, in your left hand a criminal asylum. Leonardo got both. So ding ding fortune teller person, you get to move on to the bonus round. Poisoning Borgia. Back in the late 1400s, there were rumors swirling around in Italy that the Pope's daughter really enjoyed poisoning people. Watch out for that sacramental cup of wine at church. It might have been spiked with something nasty if you got on the wrong side of Lucrezia Borgia. Lucrezia Borgia was the daughter of Pope Alexander VI and the sister of Cesare Borgia, a notorious Renaissance politician and military leader at the time. Lucrezia had a turbulent life. She was married 3 times, not the best look for the daughter of a pope, but the marriages were mostly politically motivated, like a lot of the marriages among powerful people were at the time. Her first husband was a guy named Giovanni Sforza, who was an influential Italian nobleman, and the marriage was mostly seen as a political one. Things took a turn for the worse soon after the ceremony. The marriage was annulled after Lucrezia's father, who was about to become pope, claimed that it had not been consummated and that Sforza was impotent. The move was seen as yet another political move by one of history's most politically savvy and cutthroat families, and a way to strengthen the Borgia family's other alliances in Italy. There were unsubstantiated rumors that Lucrezia played a hand in Sforza's death some years later, but nothing really concrete to base them on. Lucrezia got married again, a couple of years later, to a guy named Alfonso of Aragon, and it would be another short one. Alfonso was murdered shortly after his marriage to Lucrezia, and rumors immediately began to circulate that she had been involved in offing him. Some accounts suggest that she had him strangled, while others claim that she fed him a goblet of poisoned wine. And then she moved on to her 3rd husband, another Alfonso, Alfonso d'Este. This Alfonso managed to outlive Lucrezia, so no poison rumors there. But there's speculation that she was involved in the fatal poisoning of her own brother Juan, and was even involved in the death of her father, the Pope. Yeah, she was something else. Wu Zetian. The only woman in history who's been considered a legitimate ruler of China was also one of the most ruthless female leaders of all time. Empress Wu Zetian ruled China during the Tang Dynasty from 665 to 705 AD. She's considered one of the most brutal female rulers of all time due to her ruthless tactics, political maneuvering, and controversial rise to power. Wu Zetian was originally a concubine of Emperor Taizong, but after his death, she was exiled to a Buddhist nunnery by his son, Gaozong. However, she managed to regain favor with Gaozong and eventually became his empress consort. When Gaozong suffered a stroke in 660, Wu became heavily involved in politics, and after his death, she seized power and declared herself empress. One of the most brutal aspects of Zetian's reign was her use of the secret police, who were given the power to execute anyone suspected of disloyalty or treason. She also employed propaganda to control the population and maintain a vast network of spies to keep tabs on her subjects. She was also known for her willingness to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to her power, including members of her own family. She even ended the life of her own daughter, Princess Taiping, for plotting against her, as well as several other family members and officials who were suspected of disloyalty. But Empress Wu wasn't just a ruthless, daughter-offing, secret police-loving, propaganda-spewing dictator. She also had a fashion sense. Wu was known for her extravagant spending on luxury items like silk and jade, which were seen as a sign of power and status. She probably enjoyed a good mani-pedi, probably was a gel-tip woman. She also commissioned the construction of several palaces and temples, many of which still stand today. But despite her brutal reputation, Wu was also credited with ushering in a period of prosperity and cultural development during the Tang Dynasty. She supported the arts and literature, and a lot of the most famous poets of the era were patronized by her court. Mary Ann Cotton. First up, we have a woman whose many husbands, children, and even her own mom kept mysteriously losing their lives from something called gastric fever. So are we to believe that gastric fever is like contagious? I mean, who do I look like, Willie Foo-Foo? But the actual cause was most likely the fact that Cotton was a bit of a psychopath. Mary Ann Cotton was born in 1832 in England, and it's thought that by the time of her execution 41 years later, she'd fatally poisoned as many as 21 people, including 3 of her husbands, several of her children, her stepchildren, her own mother, and others who were in her care. Cotton's poisoning spree started in the 1850s when she married her first husband, William Mowbray. Soon after their marriage, their infant daughter died of gastric fever, and William himself fell ill and died shortly afterward. Cotton received a small inheritance from William's death, which she used to support herself and her surviving children. Cotton remarried several times over the next few years, with each husband dying soon after the marriage. She also had several children, and a lot of them passed away in infancy or childhood. She also had a tendency to take out life insurance policies on her husbands and children, collect the payments after their death, and then move on to her next victims. Cotton's crimes went undetected for a while, but she eventually came under suspicion when her last husband, Frederick Cotton, fell ill and died. An investigation revealed that several of Cotton's previous family members had died under similar circumstances. All had been what doctors thought was this thing called gastric fever. But it turns out that the symptoms of gastric fever are a whole lot similar to arsenic poisoning. Cotton was charged with murder. The ensuing trial was a pretty high-profile one in Durham in March of 1873. The prosecution presented evidence that Mary Ann Cotton had poisoned several of her family members with arsenic over the years, including her own children, husbands, and stepchildren. The prosecution also argued that Cotton had killed for financial gain, taking out life insurance policies on her victims and collecting payouts after their deaths. Cotton initially pleaded not guilty to the charges against her, but the evidence against her was overwhelming, at least in the case of her last husband, Frederick Cotton. She was only convicted of his death, not any of the other suspicious deaths of her other family members over the years. The one was enough, though. The judge sentenced her to death by sending her to the scaffold. Cotton was executed on March 24, 1873 at Durham County Prison. Her execution was witnessed by a large crowd of people who had gathered outside the prison. Cotton remained calm and composed throughout the proceedings, and her last words were reportedly, "I am not guilty. I am not guilty. God knows I am not guilty." She reportedly didn't go quickly either, despite her pleas that she wasn't guilty. The platform she was suspended from was apparently too low, and when she dropped, she was still, well, alive. And the executioner had to finish the job. Irene the Eye Gouger. Irene of Athens really wanted to be the queen of the Byzantine Empire, to the point where she was willing to gouge out the eyes of her own son. Oh, FYI, there really won't be many good examples of mother-son relationships throughout this video. Irene of Athens was a Byzantine empress who ruled from 797 to 802 CE. She was born in Athens in 752, married Emperor Leo IV in 769, and after Leo died in 780, she acted as regent for her son Constantine VI, but eventually she deposed him and took the throne for herself. Irene's reign was a unique one. She was the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right, and her gender was a source of opposition from a lot of her subjects because, the patriarchy. She also faced challenges from the military, who were not happy with her policies and leadership. When Irene's son, Constantine VI, came of age, he started challenging his mom's authority. Classic teenage drama, just one that had significant consequences for the fate of an entire empire. By 790, Irene had enough and threw her son in prison. This upset a lot of people, and Constantine was eventually freed and then staged a coup against his mom. Irene responded by raising her own army and staging a counter-coup. It was kind of a coup. Hers was successful, though. Constantine was yet again thrown into prison. This time, though, Irene had really had enough, and she ordered that Constantine should have both his eyes gouged out. Free science fact here. If you have your eyes gouged out, you can no longer see. Public service message from Captain Obvious. Anyway, the exact details of how Constantine lost his eyes are not super clear, but some sources say that it was done with a hot needle type of thing. Ooh. The decision to throw her son in jail and have him blinded had some pretty serious implications for the future of the Byzantine emperor. In 800 CE, Pope Leo III declared that the Byzantine throne was vacant, despite the fact that Irene was still sitting on it. Women, by law, were not allowed to head up the army or sit on the throne, so instead, Pope Leo nominated Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, and had him crowned on Christmas Day. Crisis ensued. Irene responded by trying to forge an alliance with Charlemagne, but she wasn't able to. More turmoil within Irene's own court sparked another coup in 802, and she was ousted and replaced by a guy named Nicephorus I. The Blood Countess. Hanging with someone nicknamed the Blood Countess ain't the same as hanging with someone nicknamed Pee-wee or Chip or Man-Man. Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory lived up to the name in a big, horrible way. Bathory was one of those horror show type people who took people to her castle and did awful things to them. What's that? Oh, yeah, allegedly. What she was accused and eventually convicted for was pretty evil. She had apparently tortured and ended the lives of over 600 people, mostly young village girls, in a sadistic spree that lasted for years. Bathory was born into a wealthy and powerful family in 1560, and she was raised in a castle in present-day Slovakia. She was well educated in all the noble ways that people got educated back then. She learned to speak multiple languages, learned to play music, was taught all the proper etiquette, and then got married to a count at the age of 15. Her husband was a military commander and was often away fighting wars, so Bathory was left in charge of managing their estates. Bathory's descent into sadism isn't exactly clear, but there are many theories about what may have driven her to commit such heinous acts. Some suggest that she suffered from mental illness. Others believe she was motivated by a desire for power or a sense of superiority over her victims. It could have been a combination of both. Living alone in a Slovakian castle can probably do strange things to people, but murder to the tune of 600 people doesn't really seem like one of them. Bathory's torture methods were particularly gruesome. She would reportedly beat, burn, and mutilate her victims using many different tools. The rumors about Bathory's atrocities eventually became too loud to ignore, and she was arrested and tried for her crimes in 1610. She apparently had some accomplices, and a lot of them ended up being sentenced to death. But Bathory herself was spared the hangman's noose, mostly because she was a noble with a castle. Man, if that ain't privilege, I don't know what is. Instead of being sentenced to death, she was sentenced to house arrest, or castle arrest, I guess you could call it. She lived out the rest of her life in plush comfort until her death in 1614, escaping any real kind of justice for the level of heinousness for her accomplices who were sentenced to death. The Mad Monarch of Madagascar. Let's move from a queen who persecuted the believers in just one branch of Christianity to a queen who didn't discriminate and simply persecuted all believers in Christianity. Ranavalina I was the Queen of Madagascar from 1828 until 1861. She's been dubbed the Mad Monarch of Madagascar, and for good reason. She was known for her brutal tactics in preserving Madagascar's culture, and traditions, which included the persecution of Christians and the use of mass executions and torture to maintain her power. Ranavalona I's reign began in a time of political turmoil as Madagascar was facing invasion by European colonial powers, particularly the French, whose traders and missionaries started arriving in the country in the 1820s and 1830s. In her defense, she inherited a kingdom that was divided and weakened by internal struggles and threatened by foreign powers, and she was tasked with the not-so-small challenge of maintaining the independence of Madagascar in the face of a lot of adversity. But the way in which she did it wasn't very savory. Ranavalona implemented a policy of brutal isolationism, which meant severing ties with foreign powers and enforcing strict control over her subjects. She outlawed Christianity and other foreign religions and actively persecuted converts to these religions. She also ordered the execution of European missionaries and any Malagasy who associated with them. Ranavalona I's methods of maintaining power were brutal and included the use of mass executions and torture. She would often order the execution of entire villages that were suspected of disloyalty and had her subjects sent to forced labor camps and compulsory military service. Failure to comply would get you punished, and punished severely. One of the Mad Monarch's favorite forms of punishment was something called trial by tangina, or trial by poison. The tangina nut was taken from the tangina shrub, which grew in Madagascar, and was believed to be poisonous. The accused person was forced to eat the nut, and their fate was determined by whether or not they survived. If they died, they were considered guilty. If they survived, they were considered innocent. It was basically the Madagascar version of a witch trial. Ranavalona I's reign came to an end with her death in 1861, and her legacy has been debated ever since. Some justifiably view her as a tyrant who ruled through fear and violence, while others see her as a powerful leader who successfully protected Madagascar from colonization. There are often two sides to every coin. The Psycho-Psychic. It's kind of easy to predict the demise of people if you're the one taking them out. This was the case of Tilly Klimek, yet another insurance-collecting serial killer who was responsible for the deaths of at least 7, maybe more, people in the Little Poland neighborhood in Chicago during the early 1900s. Klimek's first husband, John Mekovich, passed away in 1914 under suspicious circumstances. She then married a guy named Joseph Rudolph shortly after, but he kicked the bucket too. Legends have since swirled that she believed she was actually predicting the deaths of her husbands, while at the same time giving them lethal doses of arsenic. Pro tip here, it's easy to predict the death of someone when you're poisoning them. She apparently told a neighbor that she'd been having dreams where her dear Joseph would soon meet an untimely end. It's unknown whether her dreams involved cashing in her second husband's life insurance policy, which she did. In addition to her husband, Klimek was suspected of poisoning several other people, including neighbors, relatives, and friends. She reportedly poisoned them with food or drink laced with arsenic. She was particularly fond of giving them little arsenic candies as tokens of neighborly goodwill. But when her third husband, Joseph Klimek, fell ill, the authorities became suspicious. They dug up the bodies of her previous 2 husbands and found that they contained lethal levels of arsenic, and the jig was up for Tilly. At her murder trial, she reportedly wore a mourning hat that she knitted after the death of her second husband and made more claims that she could physically see the demise of her husbands before they actually happened. A wrinkle in the whole story was that there was an apparent theory that didn't just involve Tilly. As the investigation into Tilly Klimek's crimes continued, the Chicago papers began to report on a larger pattern of mysterious deaths in the Little Poland neighborhood. Other wives in the area were arrested and accused of being part of what was dubbed the Bluebeard Clique, which was led by Klimek, who allegedly had been teaching them her methods for poisoning their husbands and was considered some sort of psychic high priestess in the art of arsenic candies and insurance collection. In the end, Tilly Klimek was the only member of the Bluebeard Clique to be convicted of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison, where she stayed until she died in 1936. The Black Widow. There have been a few psychopaths over the years who've been nicknamed the Black Widow. It's not a particularly creative one, but it fits the MO of a lot of pretty psychopathic women over the years. One of the most infamous ones might be Belle Gunness, a Norwegian-born American who had a hand in the deaths of possibly 40 or more people, and a lot of the time cashing in on some pretty convenient life insurance policies. Gunness came to the U.S. from Norway in the late 1800s and settled down first in Chicago. She married her first husband, Mads Sorensen, in 1884, and they had 3 kids, 2 of which died as infants under mysterious circumstances. Their father would join them soon after. He died of a brain hemorrhage on the exact day his one life insurance policy ended and a new one began. Interesting timing. Gunnis ended up collecting $8,500. That's about $250,000 today. With that money, she moved to LaPorte, Indiana, and bought a pig farm. Her next victim/husband was a guy named Peter Gunnis, a farmer from South Dakota. They got married in 1902, and Peter died less than a year later. Bell claimed that he was killed in an unfortunate meat grinder accident while he was chopping meat. Ooh. But some eyebrows were starting to get raised, and some had their suspicions that Bell may have taken him out herself, possibly by whacking him with a meat cleaver. In any case, the Black Widow collected yet another life insurance policy, this time worth $3,000 or about $90,000 today. Gunnis soon started luring men to her farm through newspaper personal ads where she posed as a wealthy single woman seeking a romantic partner. She would communicate with her potential victims through letters and arrange to meet with them at her farm. Once they arrived, Gunnis would gain their trust and persuade them to hand over their cash and life savings to her. Some of her suitors were even known to have sold their farms and homes before making the bad move of heading over to her farm. After the Black Widow got her money, the men would disappear without a trace, and Gunnis would claim that they had left her or simply vanished. Nothing lasts forever, though, and rumors started circulating about the deaths and disappearances at the farm. In 1908, a fire broke out at Bell Gunnis' farmhouse. Neighbors were quick to respond, but by the time they arrived, the farmhouse was fully engulfed in flames. After the fire was put out, investigators found the remains of 3 children and a woman's body, believed to be Gunnis herself, in the rubble. The authorities figured that Gunnis and her children had died in the fire, but as they looked more closely at the scene, they started finding little holes in the ground on her property, holes that had the remains of people in them. Investigators began to dig up the grounds of the farm, and as they did, they uncovered more and more bodies. In total, they found the remains of at least 12 people, but it's thought that the actual number of victims was much higher. The police launched a manhunt or woman hunt because they figured that Gunnis had set fire to the house herself with her children inside in order to escape and avoid prosecution. She was never seen again. Do you have any other scary and evil women who've terrorized the history books? Let us know in the comments.
We have previously discussed the good, the weird, and the creepy ways ancient Egypt changed the world as we know it. And today we're going to expose the absolutely disgusting and repulsive secrets about their civilization. Welcome to Nutty History, and today we are revealing the filthy secrets of ancient Egypt. The Shepherd of the Rear.
This is Henry Reich. He was the first Earl of Holland and close friend to the King Charles I, who was the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He was the number 2 guy for Charles I, both literally and figuratively. Their friendship formed when Henry got the most coveted job during medieval times, the groom of the stool. Basically, the man was responsible for the king's poop.
The groom of the stool was a job for maintaining the hygiene of the king's rear, which means they were in charge of performing wiping duties for the ruler. However, such jobs were not exactly a medieval invention, and this responsibility goes back thousands of years to, you guessed it, ancient Egypt. In medieval times, it was like having the janitor's job, but with a lord's salary. However, in ancient Egypt, the job required qualified proctologists called Irene. The pharaohs were not just kings, they were considered gods and thus demanded intensive care. Irene was a medical specialist who was designated with a magnificent title of Shepherd of the Royal Anus. Yeah, you heard it right. I said anus, not highness. The court proctologist was a Niru Pehud, which meant guardian of the royal rectum, and his job was much more sophisticated than the medieval equivalent groom of the stool. But Niru Pehud had to administer enemas to the pharaoh. According to Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus, who were Greek historians, ancient Egyptians were quite considerate about their rear hygiene, and enemas were quite normal and administered often even among common people. Once again, because pharaohs were considered godly beings in Egypt, the job of Niru Pehut was very respected and desired for. They touched pharaohs in the most intimate way possible. One could say they were performing divine interventions every day. A known shepherd of the anus was a physician named Irene, who lived around 2200 BC. Their medical titles were discovered on a recycled door that was found at the Giza shaft tomb. According to the inscriptions, they specialized in different areas. They were physicians of the belly, physicians of the eyes, and also protectors of the anus. The rear end was considered important within ancient Egyptian medical beliefs as they recognized it as the source of wekedu, a corruptive substance that had to be removed in order to cure disease. The enema also held importance in Egyptian religion. The myth goes that the god Thoth invented the enema. It's interesting because Thoth is depicted with the head of an ibis, and the venerated bird can be observed using its curved beak to wash its own behind with water.
Remember in our recent video about the filthy secrets of Egyptian pharaohs? We talked about how Egyptian rulers lied about their weight and appearance in etchings and through statues. Well, their body consciousness went beyond that. They wanted to eat a lot, but also wanted to look like Instagram influencers too. Does that sound like someone you know?
So, to get rid of the excess weight without putting in any actual effort, Egyptian royalties would take laxatives at least 3 times a month to achieve the slim, muscular physique that was the beauty standard even back then. The laxative was made out of castor oil and would make them spend most of their day inside the washroom. And if that hasn't terrified you yet, remember these were the days long before plumbing was invented and Egyptians still had their toilets indoors. Pretty sure you would need a gas mask to walk into that house. Laxatives became so popular as a medical solution that Egyptians started popping them like aspirins. Cough? Take a laxative. Feeling famished? Take a laxative. Diarrhea? You wouldn't believe it, but straight up, laxative. Apparently, Egyptians took the phrase better out than in very literally, and the idea was to plunge the disease out of their bodies, no matter how much force it would take to get through the whole mess as quickly as possible. I wish we could provide you with the data on how many people succumbed to that idiocy.
The weird origins of pregnancy tests.
We've talked before about how Egyptians discovered the science of pregnancy tests that we still use to this day. You can check our video on what pregnancy was like in ancient Egypt for more information. But the road to that discovery was quite bumpy. Egyptians indeed had a whole medical system dedicated to pregnancy and childbirth, with women working as physicians side by side with their male counterparts. But they also had medical beliefs that made no sense whatsoever.
You know, for some, the color blue brings them happy news, and for others, the absence of it is a sigh of relief. The ancient Egyptian women were not so different 3,500 years ago either. Instead of small strips that are conveniently pocket-sized, which itself is a joke on modern women's clothing, they had to carry 2 pouches of seeds. A pouch of barley seeds and the other pouch consisted of seeds of wheat.
Ancient Egyptians believed that if the grain in either of the bags sprouted after peeing in them, it would be a sign of pregnancy from the gods. Now, this may sound like a baseless ancient religious ritual, but there was in fact science behind it that we still use to this day in the modern pregnancy strips. In 1963, the National Institute of Health conducted a study and found out that the ancient Egyptians' method was quite effective and worked 70% of the time. Not too shabby for an ancient civilization. Thanks to Margaret Crane, modern pregnancy self-tests became available in 1969 following the study. They rely on proteins that can detect a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. These proteins also elevate levels of estrogen in a woman's urinary system, and based on the evidence, it is speculated that estrogen helps a lot to promote seed growth, so it does all add up. However, this is where things started to get weird in ancient Egypt. If you are wondering why there were 2 bags of different grains, well, the double test wasn't only done to make sure they got it right. Ancient Egyptians had more ideas. They believed that it wasn't just a coincidence that one of the seeds would grow faster than the other.
Ancient Egyptians were certain that if barley would sprout first, it means the pregnant lady was having a boy. If the wheat wins the race, it would mean that the mother was expected to have a baby girl. Now the question is, was there any science behind that sort of gender reveal party?
Studies say there's no correlation between the gender of the baby and estrogen's effect on barley, wheat, or as a matter of fact, any other grain seeds. So ancient Egyptians were wrong about it, but even though this whole affair involves pee, it isn't exactly a filthy business. But hold on, we're just getting started. The wheat and barley test was only one of the methods that ancient Egyptians used in their long history of nearly 5,000 years. Another pregnancy test would place a supposed pregnant woman on a mash consisting of beer and dates, and pregnancy would somehow be determined by how much she vomited. If you were there to give her the good news, you couldn't go, "Aw," after seeing that. A few decades ago, there was a time when pregnancy tests were available in labs only. Ancient Egyptian women were also reliant on their physicians to test them for pregnancy in the earlier days. A lot of these physicians trusted a hands-on approach. They would rub a certain kind of oil on the woman patient's entire bare body at night and ask her to lie down until morning. Then they would do an inspection, and if they found her fresh and ripe, they would deem her either pregnant or ready to bear a child. Imagine a doctor using those creepy methods and words today. They would not only lose a patient, but maybe jeopardize their license too. Another method used was to put a clove of garlic or onion inside a woman's genitals and ask them to sleep with it. In the morning, they would check her breath, and if they smelled the garlic or onion on her breath, they would deem her tubes clean and ready to have a baby. Yes, the Egyptian physicians believed that all orifices of a woman's body were interconnected, and women's mouths had a straight connection to their genitals. If they couldn't smell shallots on her morning breath, they would deem her barren. Just like that. Then again, despite being obsessed with the cycle of life and death, ancient Egyptians had very little understanding of the human reproductive system. Another bad example of their shortcoming was evident from the fact that they assumed that men have that time of the month just like women. It was quite common for Egyptian men to have blood in their excrements, but it was also dismissed as a menstrual cycle. The truth was that schistosomiasis was rampant in ancient Egypt, and it was so common that ancient Egyptians considered blood and pee a good thing. In ancient Egypt, a model family man was the one whose body was the host of an unhealthy number of parasitic worms. The harassment was a serious issue. There is no denying that ancient Egypt was a civilization way ahead of its time with a lot of things they did and how they did them. Women, for one, enjoyed an equal academic, economic, and political status as men. Sadly, they were still considered inferior to men socially. A woman could live independently, work any job that a man could, contract her marriage, buy and sell land, file a lawsuit or divorce, and leave property to whomever she wished. However, socially, they were still not protected from being ridiculed. Like any other social and religious propaganda, ancient Egyptian wisdom and literary text also reasoned the inferiority of women, proposed restrictions on them, and also badmouthed women with liberal natures. Not only that, but catcalling, whistling, and even flashing were common malpractices and scarcely punished. Herodotus mentions in his records that it was common during sacred religious festivals for men to flash their privates at women on the shores of the River Nile while traversing on the boats. This would accompany jeering, catcalling, and teasing. Even in cases of violence and harassment against women, it was common to blame them, especially during the Ptolemaic dynasty. But the most intriguing affair that sets ancient Egypt apart from modern world problems for women was love potions. Egyptians loved magic, and obviously they tried to use it a lot for either exacting revenge or healing or wooing women who weren't even remotely interested in them. They brewed separate potions to win over women of their dreams, force a woman to subjugate to the whims of a man, make a woman enjoy bedding with someone they didn't fancy, and there were even potions to ruin others' marriages out of jealousy. Obviously, their effectiveness could be assumed to be highly questionable. The recipes of these potions were as insane as their purposes. One involved combining dandruff from a man who had died with barley, apple pips, blood from a tick that bit a black dog, the blood of the person who ordered the potion, and their semen. This concoction was to be planted in the beverage of the client's beloved to make them submit to their wishes. Seriously, if one could have someone willingly drink a potion that foul, they are already in love and you don't need any mess like that. The witness battering program. They say snitches get stitches, and it was established very early in human history with Egypt. But it isn't at all what you're thinking. In fact, both snitching and stitching were mandatory by law. After the plot to terminate Ramesses III was successful, the guards not only rounded up the conspirators, but also all of the people who were working in the pharaoh's palace and court. The court ruled that all of them had plenty of opportunities to overhear the plot and warn the guards. Because they didn't, and it resulted in the pharaoh's death, it was decreed to have their ears chopped off no matter if they were aware of the plot or not. Such precedents, though unfair, spooked people enough to rat on any criminal prep work they came across in their surroundings. Now, the ancient Egyptian guards didn't play good cop, bad cop at all. It was bad cop all the way. They were very offhand about tormenting and hurting people during investigations. Whether they were potential suspects or potential witnesses, it was common for them to begin an interrogation by tying the subject to a stake and beating their hands and feet until they felt satisfied with the answers. Even suspects' friends and relatives were subject to such harsh punishment. Obviously, with such treatment, it was quite possible that people may confess falsely to simply stop the torment. And surprisingly, ancient Egypt guards did acknowledge that. This is why they would thoroughly investigate cases and crime scenes to make sure they would get the right person prosecuted. For witnesses, the torment wasn't only physical, but psychological as well. There were no oaths to take before delivering testimony back then. Instead, ancient Egypt courts would ask the witness to describe in detail how they would like to be punished. The punishments were chosen by the court already, but it made the witness realize what the cost of their lying would be and discouraged them by planting the fear of it. The mummification industry. If you live in the modern United States, dying is not cheap. It takes over $15,000 for a funeral in the U.S. these days and can be a huge toll on the savings of a middle-class income family. Even cremation costs about $7,500. So imagine a nation that was so obsessed with the afterlife that they lived their entire life preparing for it and then had an elaborate funeral ritual to preserve their body for hundreds of years. How much did that funeral cost? Well, it wasn't easily affordable for sure. Found in the writings of a Greek traveler, it is mentioned that during the 1st century BC, the cost of mummification would have been 1 talent of silver. That's 30 kilograms, or 66 pounds of silver, for the best possible mummification treatment. It was filthy expensive. However, it is believed that as things had changed a lot under the Ptolemaic dynasty, this pricing could have been inflated. The cost of the supplies of mummification today, including linen, sodium carbonate decahydrate, or commonly known as the natron salt, resin, and incense would cost about $3,600. But we haven't even added the cost of labor yet, which was the most intricate element of the process. It's fair to assume that to be mummified today it costs around $70,000. In fact, presently, various businesses actually mummify the bodies of people as well as pets. Pet mummification can cost from $7,000 to over $100,000. Naturally, such an expensive operation wasn't feasible for everyone. This is why people from lower classes would resort to incomplete mummification. They would skip having a sarcophagus or even a coffin and leave some or all organs remaining intact during the dehydration of the body. Those who were dirt poor would sadly resort to just wrapping the deceased in cloth and burying them in the desert sand for a few weeks to dry them naturally. Unlike the rich, who would rest for eternity in a tomb painted with inscriptions from the Book of the Dead, the Pyramid Text, and the Coffin Text, the poor would be buried in unnamed graves in a cemetery. King Tut's Cursed Mummy.
The curse of King Tutankhamun can be considered the most popular hoax related to the ancient Egyptians. When Howard Carter found the untouched tomb of the young pharaoh, he did find uncursed treasures and wealth that were never seen before by an archaeologist. Carter himself lived for decades after the controversy.
However, there was one thing that was alive in King Tut's tomb. Let's just say that when King Tut was buried, his flagpole was up. Nobody knows exactly why, but Tut was the only Egyptian ruler that was found mummified with a pitching tent. The most bizarre aspect of the mystery surrounding why his tower was pointing north while being buried is that some historians believe that it didn't even belong to King Tut. Some people think that his embalmer switched his real thing with that of a more impressive donor. Gender bender. The idea of fixed genders may be a thing that is rooted in history, but it was definitely not a thing that originated in Egypt. To give you more context, Egyptians were quite cool with gender fluidity and believed that the genders were not part of the afterlife. Egyptian mythology is full of moments where many gods changed their genders, and they believed that humans would change genders after death.
As women were considered socially inferior to men, women with fulfilling lives were thought to transform into men in the afterlife. Their highly proactive gods also had more features apart from the two conventional genders. For example, it wasn't uncommon that Egyptian goddesses were represented with beards sometimes, and Queen Hatshepsut also tried to present herself with a fake one to become pharaoh.
Do you think we missed anything bizarre or disgusting about Egypt in the video? Tell us in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching Nutty History. Don't forget to like and share, and press subscribe to watch more nutty videos like this.